And now we welcome to the podcast, Ralph Mangual, or Rafael. We've been having a 5-minute conversation about the name and its many permutations. But whatever you call him, he's the contributing editor of City Journal, and he's serving as a member of the New York State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And he's the author of Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts the Most. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back.
We have another instance of police brutality, another murder, another death. Guide us through this most recent example. And keep in mind, I'm coming from Minneapolis, which set, in 2020 was the epicenter of the George Floyd movement. Take a look at what happened, what you see, what it tells you about modern policing, and just in general, what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong.
Yeah, I mean, well, what you see is something that's really difficult to watch. I mean, of course, last week, all the videos, well, not all the videos, but a good number of videos were released to the public showing the encounter with Tyre Nichols and 5 Memphis police officers. I almost said Minneapolis there. The police officers were all black. Tyre Nichols is black. That seems to have kind of muted the racial lens through which these cases are normally viewed, although it hasn't necessarily persuaded everyone to leave that particular sub-issue alone here. But basically what happened was there was some kind of traffic stop during which the officers were incredibly aggressive right at the outset. I'm not really sure what, if any, explanation exists for that particular posture that they took. That it seems to induce Tyre Nichols into a state of understandable fear, perhaps even justified fear, that causes him to resist arrest. He ends up running away after being pepper sprayed and tased. It looks like from the videos that one of the officers who deployed pepper spray in that initial encounter actually pepper sprayed himself as well as his partner. That seemed to make him very, very upset. That officer actually then leaves the scene once other cops catch up with Tyre Nichols and goes to join in on the beating, perhaps out of a sense of revenge. But not long after, Tyre Nichols is spotted by other Memphis officers who gave chase. A foot pursuit ensues. They tackle him. Then the beating starts. And it's really, really difficult to watch. There are multiple angles of this, one from a Memphis police camera that's actually above all the action, and then the body cam footage. And it becomes, really hard to push back on the idea that this was really just a beating doled out of pure rage and a sense of wanting to get revenge. One of the officers seems to roll his ankle or hurt his leg. He's seen limping around. He's upset about that, takes it out on Mr. Nichols. It looks to me. Another officer gets pepper sprayed during that second encounter. There's one point in the video where Tyre Nichols is being held up by two officers, each of whom has one arm, and he's being punched in the face by a third. And neither one of the two officers holding his arm seems to be trying to put a handcuff on him. And that tells you, a bit about just how brutal this case was. And of course, he died of his injuries 3 days later. Now, the second question you asked is, what does this say about policing? And that's really where the rubber meets the road here, because my answer is not going to satisfy
Rafa,
a lot of advocates.
Before we get to that second question, could I just ask one or two? So
yeah,
you've looked at this tape in detail. I couldn't stand to watch it. I only glanced
it's hard
at
to
it.
watch.
But the correct conclusion is by the time the footage that we have seen, by the time that moment starts, these cops are already just running on adrenaline and testosterone. They are out of control. They are enraged human beings acting on animal instincts. You don't see any semblance of training, self-control, no superior officer giving orders, nothing. So could I just, you mentioned this, but I want to go back to it just to understand as best we can what happened. From the very get-go, once Tyre's car stops, there's no officer going to the window and tapping the window and saying, "Would you step out of the car, please, sir? May I see your license and registration?" The training is already out the window. These guys are already at heart rates of, let's assume, 150. Do we have any idea what happened before the footage? Why are these guys so totally amped the moment we see them?
Yeah. I mean, so the stop.
This is not to excuse anything that happened. I just
Right.
don't understand the incident. What was going on?
So we don't know, because we don't have footage from that part we don't have footage of the lead up to the initial car stop. Now we do have in the body cam some overheard talk among the officers about what happened, what preceded the stop, and some of the officers can be heard saying that Tyre Nichols didn't stop when they lit him up, when they got behind him, that he led him on a chase, at one point nearly sideswiped one of the police officers, and that is what explains the reason that they came out with guns drawn and immediately took him out of the car and tried to put him down. Now, I don't know how true that is. There were a couple of things said during the course.
We just plain don't know for sure.
Exactly. We don't have the footage of that car chase to substantiate that kind of accusation. And so, and there are a couple of other things that the officers seem to have said on that sort of debrief period that's captured on camera that aren't necessarily backed up by what we saw. One of the officers talks about Tyre Nichols grabbing his gun. Although parts of the video are really hard to see, we did not see that in the footage that I reviewed, nor did you hear any officer in the footage that I reviewed saying he's grabbing my gun. So I'm not sure what to make of that accusation, but it's exactly right. I mean, from the very outset of the encounter, the temperature is well over 100 degrees, much too hot, I think. And, every single part of the encounter as it unfolded, including when they caught up with him a second time, I mean, there's just such a departure from training and the predominant tactics. And I think that explains why the reaction to this case has been so universal in its denunciation of what the video depicts, so universal in its condemnation of the conduct that was engaged in by those officers. I mean, police departments through their commissioners and chiefs and elected sheriffs and police unions like the FOP have all come out and said, like, this was horrible, this was disgraceful, this is not what policing is. And that actually, leads us a little bit into the second question, which is, what does this say about policing writ large? And I think that's where we tend to get into trouble as a society. It's an understandable instinct to see something terrible and want to have a good answer and want to be able to say, like, okay, well, we've got a solution here. But sometimes the lesson is just that bad people exist. Sometimes those bad people are going to have police uniforms on. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is representative of policing as an institution. And that's, I think, the fatal flaw of the reform movement, is that it pretends as if these, what are statistically isolated incidents, sort of represent the common type of encounter that you're likely to have with American police, and that just couldn't be further from the truth. And we have lots of data on this, data that I've run through with you all before. Just to update that, I mean, if you just look at the NYPD, for example, in 2021. Our officers fielded 6.4 million calls for service. They made 166,000 arrests, 4,300 gun arrests. They only recorded a total of 5,000 uses of force. Total. And most of those uses of force, like 90%, were just level 1 uses of force, which is just a takedown. They only had 36 weapons discharges in adversarial conflicts, which means that they used force in a little less than 3% of all arrests, and they used deadly force in a little less than 0.02% of all arrests. If you look at Memphis, which is where the Tyre Nichols case happened, between 2013 and 2021, police in that city made almost 300,000 arrests. They only killed 25 people. Almost all 25, of course, were justifiably killed because they posed a deadly threat to the officers. And so, again, that comes out to less than 1/100%, sort of death rate. And this is something that I think, is important context that often gets left out of the conversation. The fact of the matter is that deadly police use of force, and really police use of force of any kind, is not a particularly likely outcome of a police-citizen interaction. Police make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of arrests on the national level, about 10 million arrests a year. They don't use force in anywhere close to a majority of that. They use force somewhere around 2 to 3% of the time. In some cases, in some departments, it's even less than that. And so I think there's a limit to the conclusions that we can draw about the institution from these kinds of incidents, especially when those incidents are so clear departures from what is taught in police academies, what is instilled through training, and what the rules of the department are. And so what I don't think we should do is what we did in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd's murder, which is to denounce policing as an institution, attach the conduct of the worst officers to everyone that wears a badge, and then pull policy levers that ultimately make life worse for everyone.
That statistic, that deep, the likelihood of a violent encounter is irrelevant to the people who want depolicing, and it's not helpful. Here in Minnesota, Minneapolis, we have a problem with the light rail systems becoming overrun with people who are doing drugs and behaving poorly and passing out and just acting out in criminal ways. And there's an actual movement to maybe get some officers onto the trains to kick the people off. And it's being fought by people who insist that this is precisely the problem, that any encounter with the police is likely to go south, and that it is a systemic and a systemic offense that has disproportionate impact, and therefore we cannot clean up our subway. They had our trains; they have to just roll on in the filthy condition that they are. How do we get around that? I mean, the statistics that you quote would seem to clarify matters for some people, but they're downplayed at every time, and we're told that the opposite is the case.
Yeah, well, they're downplayed because I think ultimately what the reform movement is really about is not necessarily getting better results, right? I think the terrible results help their cause, which is why they're so keen to deprive the system of resources through defunding or through new unfunded mandates for reporting or some other kind of compliance requirement that limits the capacity of the system to do what it does. And, that discourages, for example, high quality candidates becoming cops. And this is something that I think might turn out to be particularly relevant in this Memphis case, because as I understand it, all of the police officers involved were not particularly experienced. I think the most experienced officer involved had less than 5 years on the job. And that department, in order to make it more representative of the community, and to kind of deal with the recruitment and the retention crisis that it's been going through along with police departments around the country, recently lowered standards a couple years ago. And that, again, I've said this on multiple occasions in prior venues, but if you make policing the kind of job that good-hearted, highly motivated, highly intelligent people who are psychologically stable don't want to do in increasing numbers, what you're going to end up with is a police force that looks a lot more like the perps they're being asked to police than they might have in the past. And that's a really bad thing. And, one of the reasons why I feel confident in saying that I'm not convinced that the reform movement really cares about results is that all the things that they allegedly care about have been moving in the right direction in recent years. In 1971, the NYPD started reporting on use of force data. They shot and wounded over 220 people. They killed almost 100. Today, those numbers are down to about 24 people shot by the police and less than 10 people killed by the police. And all of them are justifiably subjected to deadly force. And so, that's an enormous amount of improvement, even if we're not yet at the point of perfection. And yet,
even as the city has become demonstrably safer in those years.